Welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast. My name is Anthony Oliver, and today we will be examining energy transition and asking what the UK has to do to deliver on its ambition to electrify the future economy. The National Infrastructure Commission's latest 5-year assessment highlights a number of strategic priorities for the UK, not least the need to accelerate the energy sector's move away from fossil fuels to ensure we reach our net zero emissions targets by 2050. Targets underlined, of course, by the latest COP28 global gathering in Dubai. And that means not only having to decarbonise our electricity generation by investing in wind, solar, biomass and nuclear power, but also it will mean bolstering and expanding the way that this power is distributed and stored. Now, some progress is being made. Renewables already account for around 40% of the UK energy mix, with over 55 gigawatts of installed capacity in offshore wind and onshore wind, in solar and biomass and in hydro, and that's up 6% in the year. But the reality is that there's no shortage of potential sites and no shortage of potential investors, but there is a huge problem bringing forward these projects, and in particular navigating the planning process to enable investment to flow into projects and connections to be made into the existing grid. It's a huge and very important topic, so it's my pleasure to welcome Julia Prescot, Deputy Chair of the National Infrastructure Commission, to the podcast today. Julia is also co-founder of investment fund Meridian, and amongst many other things is currently driving the £2.4 billion NewConnect energy interconnector between Germany and the UK. So Julia, welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast.
Anthony, thank you, and thank you for describing where we are at the moment. It's great to be here.
No problem. Well, let's kick off, Julia. I mean, the National Infrastructure Commission's needs assessment, it was clear when it comes to energy transition. I mean, action is now urgent, it says. Government will need to accelerate the deployment of renewable generation and flexible technologies to provide that electricity if the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't blowing. So what's stopping it from happening?
Well, I think when we look at the wider challenges and opportunities facing infrastructure, I'd like to refer to the 4 Ps: pace, partnership, parity and pragmatism. I'm sure I'll talk about all of these in more detail later, but it's the first one, pace, that is at the heart of the question about our progress in the energy transition. As we say in the National Infrastructure Assessment, above all, we need to get on with it. And I've long argued for a greater focus on pace rather than perfection to get things going. But investors really need robust and sustained policy support to make sure that projects are both viable and investable. And the energy transition is moving at speed, so we now need that policy support to also move at speed to keep pace. And a series of policy sprints could make a real difference. You mentioned already one of the roles that I have, which is chair at NeuConnect, the new UK-Germany interconnector project. And I want to give this a really good example of where things can move at speed. What we've got is a project supported by the cap and floor model. It's got a clear and robust model in place. And this meant that we could, as investors, gain the confidence to actually invest from right up front and then move at great speed. And so that's what we did. We took what was literally a line on the map in 2018 to turn it into a fully financed £2.4 billion project in just 4 years by getting to financial close in 2022. So it shows that with pace, we can actually move at speed. We need pace and the right support.
I was wondering where that pace, not perfection slogan came from. Clearly, it came from yourself. I mean, you've mentioned a few of the things that need to happen. Building on that, Julia, where are the particular log jams when it comes to bringing forward investment in vital energy transition infrastructure? I referred to both investment in generation, but also transmission. I mean, how do you see the challenge?
Well, I think what I'd say is that we need to go back again to the sort of the beginning of the process. And in terms of policy, I don't think we're doing too badly. We've had a national infrastructure strategy. We've had national infrastructure assessment very recently. But I think one of the issues that we do have is actually translating that policy into delivery. I always like to describe it as being how can I put it, a chasm in between need on the one side and availability of money on the other. What we have in between, crossing the chasm, are some rather narrow bridges at the moment.
Right.
And they need to be widened to carry the business models that can take us from need into a financing mode. Right. And to be honest, I think that what we tend to do perhaps in the public sector, is assume that if you create enough policy and put it out there, then somebody's going to pick it up. And what I think we need to think about is not just the policy, but where does it go from that? How does it get into business models? What is the longer term supply chain going to look like? How is the whole thing going to be delivered, not just from A to B, but from A to Z?
Okay, well, the NIC estimates that the energy sector requires private investment of around 20 to 35 billion per year between 2025 and 2050. The reality is that infrastructure, whether it's energy or for transport or communications, it all operates as a system, whereas investors need to invest in discrete projects. You use the phrase bookending, a clear and defined project with clear and defined revenue that project finance could be applied to. Can you expand and give your thoughts around what has to happen to translate the wider strategies around, say, energy policy into the business models needed for developers to invest?
Well, I think I'd unwrap it a little bit by saying when you're talking about private finance, you're talking about the two main sources of private finance, either the big corporates who are using their balance sheets to invest in infrastructure, or more standalone project finance type infrastructure, in which a lot of investors are very interested in. And we're beginning to see those types of models, for example, coming through in the water sector in the DPC models. So what we've actually got there is the corporates are doing their own corporate thing. They're looking at their strategy. They're putting these things on balance sheet. But when you have an off-balance sheet standalone project finance project, it is absolutely constrained by the financial discipline that's required. So you need to know how much you're going to spend, how it's going to be paid back again, what your leverage is, where your equity is coming, where your debt's coming, and the ratios involved in that. So that's why I use the bookend idea, because to get one of these project finance projects underway, this discipline is very clear in terms of what you need to do.
So if you've got a bookended generation project, you also need to make that work with another bookended transmission project.
Indeed, and that's where you, for example, get upgrades to substations at the end of major transmission lines. And I think it's sometimes quite clear, in fact, it could be clearer in the energy system, sometimes in the transport system, that is actually where your project begins and ends. And you are responsible on a contractual basis up until the point and when that particular asset comes to an end. And so yes, you have to think of it in a system. And one of the things that we're very much promoting at the NIC is a more spatial approach. If you're doing a project finance type approach, within that spatial approach, you have to have a point A and a point B, and that is what can be financed.
Okay. So I'm just drilling into that slightly more. So is that where the problem lies? Is because you can have lots of fundable, deliverable, discrete projects, but if they don't all work together, then you don't have those business models, those business cases don't stack up. Well,
I think the context of them working together is in the overarching energy system rather than as a series of lines on a map. Because really within a business model, you would have one business model per one approach to project finance. Coming back to interconnectors again, we have one cap and floor model that covers our interconnector. It doesn't cover other interconnectors in the same place. And that is then brought together within the overarching system. That enables the project to go ahead.
Okay. I said that we're making some progress on renewable generation, but it's only capacity, of course. Looking at National Grid's dashboard, gas is still reliably delivering probably over half of our national demand. Of course, unless the wind is really blowing hard or the sun is really shining a lot. Should we be pleased with the progress we're making right now?
I think if you look comparatively, we are ahead of the curve in relation to the amount of renewables that we've actually put onto the system. And I think that, again, the development in offshore wind and North Sea has been extraordinary, and we are well known for being world leader on that. Whilst we got historically good progress, as you'll have seen from the last auction on CFD that wasn't successful, this isn't necessarily inexorable. And I think we need to look very closely at what we're getting by way of value for money and at the same time, what investors are prepared to invest in. And there have been alterations now to the CFD regime that I think will put more renewables onto the system.
Well, you gave evidence recently to the Commons Energy Security and Net Zero Select Committee, in which planning delay was central to the discussions in relation to connection delays in particular. I think you referred to delays moving from something like 2.6 years to currently around about 4.2 years. Why are we struggling so much with planning?
Gosh, I can give you the background from the top on that. But when the Planning Act was put in place in 2008, which introduced the idea of nationally significant infrastructure projects, the structure was actually meant to take away the contention, as it were, from the projects coming into being, because the national policy statements had been created by the government to give, again, an overarching view. And so when these projects of planning came in front of the planning inspectorate, they could then act as inquisitor as opposed to arbiter.
Right.
And in the early years, up past that 2008 Planning Act, things worked relatively well. And it's in the later years, what we see today, that we've now seen this extension from 4 to 4.2 years. And extensions in planning approvals are really very damaging in terms of pace. So there's a whole series of real downsides in having these delays. And I think going back to it, I think if you want to pin delay on something, it is actually a delay in getting those national policy statements that sit right on the top of the pyramid.
Yeah, I mean, you also spoke very powerfully about the need to partner with communities, because of course, communities are really at the heart of that whole planning process. And the government recently announced payments to communities, who are in the path of new power lines, for instance. Is that the solution? Community kickbacks, actually bribing communities to have power distribution through their areas?
Well, I think when you look at communities that have got transmission or distribution going through their areas, they are actually providing a national service, as it were, because these will be transiting electricity from one point to another. What we now see is those local communities actually being very suitable recipients of benefits. Now, with the NIC, what we talked about was actually having a menu of benefits. And benefits can be either, as proposed by the government, you'll have seen recently, a specific series of payments or discounts to bills, or they can be benefits by way of having local amenities created. But the main discussion point is really that idea, if you're providing a national benefit, then you should be achieving local benefit as well.
Interesting also, the Select Committee Chair Angus Brendan McNeill said he thought the issue of constraint payments, which they're essentially money that is paid out to generators of the grid, can't cope with their output at any particular time. He said it's soon going to be a national scandal. It's currently at around about £600 million a year. I think it could reach, you said, $3 billion in the next 5 years. Is that a scandal that's brewing?
I think a better way that I would look at it is in the context of what I've just been saying about the cost of delays. When we actually think about, something like a constraint payment, it is being paid because there are delays in the planning system, which means that we can't get the energy, the renewable energy, from its site, where it is at the moment, to where it can be suitably sold and used. And which I have to say, I'm delighted that, both sides of the political divide are very interested in supporting. I think everybody sees that the delays in planning are doing nobody any good, and they're costing quite a bit of money. But
because it's not just about electrification, the NIC also talks about adding low carbon, flexible technologies to the electricity system to ensure supply remains reliable and secure. What does that mean then?
I think when we were talking about flexibility within the National Infrastructure Commission, what that looked at is that how we could ensure that energy would be delivered or electricity would be delivered to individuals on a timely and appropriate basis, so that if we have a number of renewables in the system, then clearly, as you've already alluded to, the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. And so therefore we need both shorter and longer term facilities that do enable us to be flexible in terms of our sources of energy. Mm-hmm. And I think some of those shorter term arrangements on areas such as batteries, for example, you can see that there's significant investment at the moment in battery construction. I think you can also look at interconnectors. That's another short term. In the longer term, we currently very much rely on the gas system, the gas power stations to take up the slack. We would hope that would either be hydrogen power stations in the future or gas with carbon capture and storage associated with them. So the flexible system is to say, let's focus on renewables. Renewables are the cheapest source. There is no additional cost in the same way that there is in gas once you've got the system up and running. But what you do need to make sure that the system itself, the energy system, the electricity system itself, is flexible enough to provide the right energy at the right time. Okay.
I mean, if you speak to investors, I mean, they do still highlight this lack of real government policy in these areas. They talk about there being some confusion. They talk about the issues are not really prioritised. I mean, is that something you agree with? What has to happen if that is the case?
Well, I think that again, I would go back to what I was saying earlier about the whole sort of. The whole cycle from policy through to delivery, to the shovels in the ground. And I think what we're seeing now is, and certainly what we saw in the NIA, was a very clear policy document. And in certain areas, if you look at, offshore wind, for example, we've got CFDs at work. If you look at one of our shorter term forms of flexibility, pump storage hydros, there is still no business model available within those that enables the projects to go ahead. And you'll have seen from there's a lot in the press about SSE and Corrie Glass. So I think that what investors sometimes look at, they invest in the things that work well, the offshore wind. They're investing in batteries, but they can't get into pump storage hydro. And what this means is that when investors look at the whole sort of panoply of opportunity, they say, but look, I can't do that bit, or I can't do that bit, or that bit doesn't make sense to me. So I think the real focus needs to be on having a series of sprints in the areas where we have been lagging behind, to make sure we're moving forward on a broad enough front, and to give investors as well the feeling of policy stability. It's absolutely critical. Yeah. Because otherwise they will go elsewhere.
well, quite, yeah. I mean, the policy stability, there are an awful lot of governments around the world who are offering, the US, for instance, has got its IRA, its Inflation Reduction Act, which is really kind of driving things. And I suppose, the UK, we heard the Prime Minister talk recently about the green levy pushing up the cost of, in his words, the cost of energy for consumers, and his response is to slow down that energy transition. I mean, presumably that's something which you wouldn't agree with. I don't know. I mean, where's the NIT on this?
Well, I think, first of all, there's an awful lot been written about the green levy. There was also a great deal of concern about the proportion of electricity prices it was taking up. The point of the green levy is actually to provide additional income for environmental schemes, but also to provide additional income for new technology and new ways of doing things that are going to help us with renewables. But we're very keen to really allow it to be clear that electricity prices are dropping. And so therefore we would prefer to see the green levy part of general taxation, as opposed to being attached either to electricity or gas prices, because we think that it is, in general terms, more of a distortion than a direct payment relating to the cost of those methodologies.
Right. Julia, let's talk a bit about you. I mentioned you're Deputy Chair of the National Infrastructure Commission, but it's just one hat that you wear. Let's have a romp through your other things you're involved in. Started with Meridiam, the Paris-based infrastructure investment fund that you founded in 2005. How did this come about? How did you kick off such a business?
Well, I've been in the infrastructure world for many years prior to actually being one of the co-founders of Meridiam. And I certainly felt that it was time that infrastructure was focused on not as a sort of a financial mechanism, as it were, but actually a really tangible, literally concrete manifestation of what I was interested in and what I'd like to see built. It seemed to be a fascinating thing to do, a very exciting thing to do. We're back in 2005. And when it was potentially easier for individuals to actually go out there and say, we want to set up an infrastructure fund. And we particularly, as I say, focus not just on investing in infrastructure as a financial asset, but the DIAM for Meridiam is develop, invest and asset management, because we looked at a very long cycle investment in infrastructure. The initial funds were all 25 years. We did a lot of pre-financial close, really early stage development. And as I said, there was this real great focus on actually looking at projects over their entire life cycle.
Right.
That's really important, because if you're not looking to sell your asset, you're actually looking to manage your asset better. It really does change the mindset. And that's the case to the extent that Meridiam, since its inception in 2005, hasn't actually sold any assets.
So you're in it for the long term, yeah?
Yeah. No, our first investment was the Limerick Tunnel in Ireland. We're still an investor in the Limerick Tunnel in Ireland.
Well, one of your big investments today, of course, and one you mentioned earlier, is the 2.4 billion New Connect submarine power cable, now under construction between England and Germany. I mean, it's complex. It involves many nations, a huge number of stakeholders, I imagine, and it's expensive. I mean, how do you get that kind of project off the ground?
Well, I think you take the same spirit that you had, in terms of setting up Meridiam originally, which is to look at a good proposition, a good underlying proposition in economic terms, and then think right at the beginning of the development stage, because personally I was involved right at the beginning of the development thing, how are we going to achieve it? To try and put the best people together to bring this forward. And it was always a question of having an absolute determination to bring everybody together for what was a very sensible project in the context of both linking the UK and Germany together, making sure that we had the lowest cost of electricity between the two parties, and actually then getting the financing together. And no, it wasn't easy. We went through, and I'm trying to think which order they came in, Brexit, and then we had COVID, and then we had the great inflation, associated with the Ukraine war. And through that, we were absolutely determined to succeed on it. And I think, certainly with the support of Meridiam and the belief in Meridiam that there was a proper business model there, we got off the ground. You can't actually go into the marketplace unless you have a very well structured, very well thought out economic project and raise 2.4 billion in project finance debt, because we already had the equity, do an equity raise, unless you have a very sensible, detailed, well put together project.
Meanwhile, you're also director of Dutch EV charging group, Allego, which has got more than 34,000 charging points across Europe and one of the biggest of its kind. NIC called for 300,000 more chargers by 2035. It's a good business to be in, I presume, but it's something of a wild west, I imagine, in terms of standards at the moment. I mean, is that fair?
I mean, I think that obviously the market is new. I think people are deciding where they can focus, deciding where they can put their processes together that allow them to put chargers into key spots. I think what we're now doing is we're seeing again, a very determined approach to cover a number of different markets with these ultra-fast charging stations. And that's really now coming through in a very clear way. What are the issues? The distribution, sometimes it's quite difficult to actually get your connection in place. I think the UK is one of the more difficult markets in Europe in terms of connections. But there are problems across various areas. But yes, it's evolving. 300,000 is not, to me, isn't a great figure because it doesn't differentiate. And ultimately, if we have 20,000 ultra-fast chargers, we don't need 300,000 ultra-slow chargers.
Correct. Do you drive an EV yourself?
A Honda CR-V, so it counts as a hybrid, I think.
Right, okay. Two more roles then to talk about. First, you're a non-exec and deputy chair at Port of Tyne. Why? What fires you up about that business?
Well, I'm really excited. I think it's a fantastic business, Port of Tyne, and I think it's been really exciting to be part of, because I've been a non-exec there since 2019. And what I've seen is actually a port that has transitioned away from being the sort of Coles to Newcastle or Coles from Newcastle sort of image into a real platform for green energy development, and now has the headquarters of Equinor based in the port. So I find it really exciting to be part of something transformational. I think from the point of view of investment, I think the Northeast doesn't get its fair share. And I was absolutely delighted to be able to support £100 million financing that the port did last year, which is partially fully commercial and partially supported by the UKIB. And that is actually to work, again, looking into the future, saying what else can we do to the port and using that investment. Because the Port of Tyne as well, which I'm delighted to say, is a trust port. And that means that in itself, it doesn't have any equity capital available. It is held in trust for the local people. And as a result, it means that when it raises funding, it has to use very innovative structures and very beneficial structures, such as the 100 million that was done last year. Okay. It's a great place to work, great people. Great. Fantastic.
One to watch for sure. So lastly, for the moment anyway, you're a director at Wilton Park. Now, that's an executive agency of the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office and something of a Foreign Office think tank. I mean, is that right? I mean, what does it do?
Well, I think Wilton Park would really think of itself as a convener of ideas and in support of Foreign Office approaches and policy. And again, I'm a great believer in the power of convening people together, talking over ideas. The breadth of that discussion that can take place at Wilton Park is extraordinary. And so therefore it's a very key part of my makeup, wanting that, bringing people together to take things forward.
Okay. Well, there's so much going on in your world, Julia. I mean, I haven't mentioned a lot of it, but you've also got roles with G20, World Bank, etc. I mean, how do you fit it all in? What do you do to relax?
Well, I do. There are lots of things I do to relax. I must admit, I'm a very keen walker. I find it really blows all those cobwebs away. And I'm also a keen theatre goer. I will block book tickets just to make sure I absolutely go. And also have a pretty large family as well. So, all of that sort of, you prioritise, you take these ideas out of your head, but you also add them back into the things you do on a day-to-day basis. Okay.
Let's talk a bit about the future generation, because I know that you're also an honorary professor at UCL, and you're behind, as the name suggests, this Prescot Scholarship for Women in Leadership for Infrastructure and Construction at UCL's Bartlett School of Sustainable Construction, and that offers, I believe, scholarships for young professionals. How did that come about? I mean, what's the goal around that?
Well, I think this brought together two particular activities that I'm passionate about. One is the role of women in infrastructure. Women are not well represented, to say the least, across all areas of infrastructure. And I do think that diversity in thinking is incredibly beneficial in terms of what we can deliver. And also having been for many, many years a woman in infrastructure, I think I can understand a little bit of the issues involved. So that's one whole area. But then I would ally that to a particular interest in supporting education. I do this across a number of different areas. And so what I want to do when I was talking to the Bartlett, there were two particular courses where I lectured in one, which is their infrastructure finance course. And the other thing is they're setting up a new MBA in project management. And I think particularly in the MBA, it's for people in their sort of early 30s or so. And that's a particularly difficult time for a woman to take time out from her career to really get, as it were, sort of a year's shot in the arm of higher education and go back again. And so I said I would be very happy to support our female candidates or candidate, actually, who could then have the freedom to come and take roles that otherwise that men were taking. And that's how I got involved in setting up these Prescot scholarships. Okay, yeah. The other ones I would say are infrastructure finance. I know from my investment activities that one of the things, for example, we're investing in Africa. Everybody talks about institutional capacity, lack of understanding. And I wanted to bring together both my knowledge of the need of that type of support for people looking at infrastructure in Africa together with the support for women. So that is for female African candidates.
Okay. Let's just close out by talking a bit about some of the barriers and what has to happen next. I mean, one of the things that you say in the assessment is around removing barriers and accelerating decisions. You know, there's too many barriers that slow down decision making, and it all makes investment in the UK less attractive. Can you see that there are simple ways to really accelerate and to speed up the policy making?
I think I go back to my original 4 Ps in relation to that, because I think pace, certainly. You know, there are areas that we've talked about so far today that really need a real pace, real sprint to get them through, so that we have investment that is investable, also assets that can be invested in across a very wide area. Looking forward, we need to work a lot more on partnership. We know that the public sector can't deliver everything by itself. The private sector and public sector need to work together. There are been huge benefits from having those type of public-private partnerships going forward, and I think we need to think about more of them. I talked about parity. I'd like to talk about how this is an absolutely critical part of our activities going forward to make sure we've got as much diversity, because I think it leads to better decision-making and better applicability of the investment. Mm-hmm. And then finally, pragmatism. We've got to de-link what is really short-termist as far as government is concerned, and to think about the long term. I mean, that goes back to the whole concept of Meridian and the 25-year funds. Infrastructure isn't for the short term. It goes over a series of new governments. Yeah.
And you say it's about partnerships, and that means government on the one hand, but the private sector also on the other side. So it's that partnership that makes it work.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Well, that's a good point to lead the discussion. Thanks so much, Julia. It's a really, really complicated issues that you're wrestling there with, but also some really exciting potential outcomes there. So I hope we've brought some clarity to this subject. So thanks for joining me today.
Well, let me just say I'm really optimistic about the future. I think there are many opportunities out there. And I think we're in a really good position to take advantage of them if we do some of the things we've been talking about today.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Julia. That's all we've got time for today, though. We've got more from the Infrastructure Podcast in the pipeline and more guests to talk to as we continue to probe the big issues faced across the sector. If you haven't done so already, do check out the Infrastructure Podcast website. That's www.infrastructure-podcast.com, where you'll find background information to the issues we've discussed today and all the latest podcasts to listen to and share. So thanks for joining us. Thanks again to Julia, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.